Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 13th of September. We have a lot of important updates beginning with the Vuhledar front, then Pokrovsk, Selidove, Ukrainsk, some really important developments, but also I want to give my thoughts as to the midterm future in that region. Looking northwards, we'll look at Chasiv Yar, Kharkiv, and of course the Kursk situation. We're going to get a clearer view of what's going on over there now that the dust has sort of settled after the first few days of really significant changes. Beginning with Pishchane and just to the west of it, the Russian forces have captured territory amounting to 6.5 square kilometers. They advanced 3 kilometers westwards from their forward positions in the village itself, taking over large swaths of open fields that are relatively undefended. No trenches really built in this area, and the Ukrainians are no longer present in what I would refer to as the hinterlands. This hinterland is this sort of open field region in between this chain of villages under Russian control, marked with these two red lines, and the chain of villages running along this highway leading into Velika Novosilka. So you don't really have a solid Ukrainian presence from the 58th Motorized Brigade located in between of those two chains. And this region marked with X is actually on slightly higher elevation than the two river valleys, which is important to take note of because it gives the Russians a localized advantage when they're looking into an area like Zolotoniva. But according to Deep State, for instance, there is no longer a solid Ukrainian presence here. Until we get proof of the Russians storming it, then I won't change the composition of the map here just yet. But definitely the Russians are inching closer. And Pishchane, for instance, the Russian storming operation here lasted 2 to 3 days. It was really methodical because months in advance, the Russian forces had gone from house to house, were able to map out any potential strong points that the Ukrainians could have used to repel Russian ground assaults, but also larger armored columns wherever ATGMs could have been placed. And they just incessantly bombed it. A lot of artillery or fab strikes that just took out all of the key areas of Pishchane. So by the time the Russians were actually ready to storm it, the Ukrainians didn't have enough areas where they could set up and effectively counter the Russian presence. And that was a big part of why they were overrun so quickly. Of course, you also have to keep in mind the lack of defenses, more generally like trenches, but also the fact that it's not as mined and that the Ukrainians don't have many men here. All of that still applies. And you could say the same thing about Zolotoniva. And it's actually an even smaller settlement. It is still important, though, because it is on the same highway leading into the southeastern entrance to Velika Novosilka. Again, really important Ukrainian node, which the Russian forces, up until recently, at least in their imagination, if they had any sort of plans of reaching it, it would have had to been done through a direct advance from the south, from village to village, along a low-lying river valley, all the way up north, crossing over multiple bodies of water until they enter into this dense urban area from one narrow corridor. Now the Russians have changed the equation by pushing in from the southeast. So although we're not seeing that much of a Russian emphasis on pushing here, they did take control of this region over here. So I really would keep an eye in the midterm for developments towards Velika Novosilka. But just to look at areas that are more pertinent right now, we're going to zoom in on the Pokrovsk front. As you can see over here, a bit more south around Hrodivka, Hostre, a lot of the polygons I still have marked as yellow, but these are not the advances from the past 24 hours. These are the advances that I marked in my previous video, so there should not be any confusion. Russian sources over the past 24 hours mentioned the capture of additional territory just west of Hrodivka near the cemetery marked with an X, meaning that the Russians are really close to approaching Alexanderpil on this eastern bank of the Vavcha River, only about 3 kilometers away. They also claim to have fully taken over Austria, which is not verified yet because they've only been filmed during Ukrainian footage in the eastern side of the hamlet. But it is important to note that permanent Ukrainian resistance in this village is no longer possible due to how small it is and due to the veracity of the Russian attacks, or really the tenacity, I should say. And the escape routes for the Ukrainians, as you can see, I'll mark them here in red for you guys. You have a direct escape westwards towards Ostrivske, southwards towards Maximilianivka. You could also take a detour northwards and then either go to Alexanderpil or to Kharkivka. And so there are a few ways out for the remaining Ukrainians in Hostre. And you could say the same thing applies to whatever Ukrainian remnants from small squads are still operating in tree lines east of the Vavcha River over here in this X region because they are still here. The situation is fluid, but they're still operating there nonetheless because the Russians have not been able to consolidate control there yet. But as time goes on and the Russians continue to put pressure from the southern flank, it becomes more and more difficult for large amounts of Ukrainian soldiers to safely make it across the river. They could do it physically by crossing over the river. They could do it probably by swimming. I don't know how deep it is, but it is very narrow. And so there is that possibility, even if there's not a crossing. And if they really do insist on crossing over physically, then they'd have to advance southwards over here and then reach the same junction that I talked about that is west of Hostre. And doing so at this point in time is really dangerous because of how close it is to the front line. And so, of course, they could still withdraw, but it's going to be much more dangerous. Russian sources also mentioned that there was significant bombardment of this old penal colony west of Hostre. This would be, I guess, the local fallback line for the Ukrainians, just an area where they can recoup and prevent deeper attacks towards the eastern approaches of Krakow, because that's really a really top priority for the Ukrainians at the moment to prevent that. And that's why they're still holding on to Hrodivka. Certain elements of the 46th and 79th Air Assault Brigades are doing that at the moment. And in the process, it's sort of creating these pockets that you see marked in X where there may be Ukrainian troops here, but the situation really would not make it conducive for them to continue holding on because of how salient it is really forming that could be enveloped. So that's just one example. And then on a larger scale, you have this Vavcha River pocket that has still not been closed as the Ukrainians still try to buy time and are in the process of the complete withdrawal in a defensive fighting manner. Now, as you look northwards towards Ukrainsk, this is important because you have reporting from Russian sources that Ukrainians only control around 15% of the town, and that most of their garrison from the 25th Airborne Brigade is operating either in this factory region or in the waste heap. That could be true, but there's not enough proof to show that the Russians have actually entered into the center of Ukrainsk, including a lot of these moderately large apartments, sometimes private residential areas or duplexes that you see marked still as blue on my map. These areas, they may or may not be right now subjected to Russian assaults. We do know that the Russians, at the very least, did create this significant pincer from the south, infiltrating into the plantations through here in an area that was unexpected from the Ukrainian side, because really a lot of their resources were put in to preventing head-on assaults from Lysivka. Now, despite that fact, the Russians were able to use this direct horizontal route to enter into Lysivka, which means that now the eastern corner is sort of in a gray zone, back and forth fighting, the Russians trying to consolidate control. We are aware of the video from September 12th of the Ukrainian volunteers that encountered a Russian soldier in southern Hrodivka as they were evacuating civilians. And that was, of course, confirmation that the Russian troops are actually operating here. And then a bit to the north, you also have the most successful pincer operation, which was this really large Russian spearhead from Mimrik, able to cross over multiple fields and vertical tree lines, cross over the Ukrainian anti-tank ditch and their dragon's teeth, which again, there's no utility to those if you're not going to receive a significant blowback while crossing over, because the Ukrainians don't have the means by which to organize a large amount of shelling towards Russian troops advancing over here at the same time. They can't concentrate that fire, and they also don't have the men to send in to repel those attacks. And so just having a static line of an anti-tank ditch, it doesn't really do much. In fact, it can help the Russians because it gives them a route themselves to more safely get closer and close in on the northern flank of Hrodivka. That's actually what they're doing at the moment. And besides advancing along the anti-tank ditch, they, of course, went past it, continue taking fields westwards, and now this is creating a lot of questions about the integrity of the Ukrainian defense, not just in Ukrainsk, but more generally, if you zoom out. The Russians here have a really golden opportunity to do several things that we're going to look at. And depending on what the Russians are able to do, and that also, of course, depends on where the Ukrainians place certain units, this could have a lot of midterm implications. So, for instance, the Russians being able to break through the defense line over here, which really wasn't manned by the Ukrainians, means that there's not much in their way as they continue to advance directly westwards. These regions that you see marked with the red arrows, they are on higher elevation, located south of Selidove. not a lot of density of defenses here, not even fortresses that are isolated, just open fields in a lot of cases. Sometimes ravines that could actually be used by the Russians as routes to enter and knock on the southern flank of Selidove. That's one thing. They could also, of course, cut off the rail connection between Cukurnie and zooming out a lot of other Ukrainian villages in the Donetsk rear, leading all the way to Hrodivka, which I hope could be seen over here. But looking a bit southwards, just to calibrate again, you could see that there is a potential for getting control over a really significant higher elevated area south of Selidove, which would negate any sort of Russian need for advancing into Selidove directly from the east, and that would avert a lot of casualties or prevent a lot of Russian soldiers from needlessly dying, as they are right now. They're dying in the process of engaging in back and forth fighting with the National Guard units in the eastern parts of Selidove or in the western sections of Mikhailivka. A lot of future casualties could be prevented by putting this additional pressure in from an unexpected area. Additionally, the capture of Tsurkunie, it would really sever the connection between the Ukrainians at the front line, this large quantity of Ukrainian soldiers that have just consistently been pushed back and are overwhelmed after all of the months of fighting, or they may be new units that were recently moved in and are just consistently being moved around. And of course, the Ukrainian rear, there could be that disconnection, not entirely, but Tsurkunie acts as a really important bridge between those two worlds. And besides that, if it were to be captured, you'd have a rather narrow corridor for connections between the Ukrainian garrisons that you see mentioned on my map in Hrodivka, in Kurakivka, in Vovchenka. It would be a corridor of around 8 kilometers before you reach the reservoir north of Kurakove, and the area would just be endlessly bombarded by the Russians. Also, there's not many roads in that corridor that are going horizontally, so the transportation would be through open fields. So again, we're not even looking at a pocket being formed east of the Vavcha River. We're looking at the pocket potentially being expanded even further west to include villages like Hrodivka that we previously didn't imagine could be engulfed in such a pincer maneuver, but they really could be, depending on what happens with this northern flank of Ukrainsk. So just to zoom in once again, the Ukrainians are still holding on to it for that exact reason, because ceding control over Ukrainsk would mean that the Russians have full access to crossing over the defense line marked in yellow, reaching Tsurkunie, then also beginning the operations inside of Hrodivka. Regardless of what happens with flanking, they could actually begin the first engagements in houses, because right now the Russians are very close to doing that, but they are waiting to see what occurs nearby with sort of the northwestern flank of Hrodivka before they expend additional resources in another sort of urban type combat. So that's all important to keep in mind as we go forward. And as we look a bit northwards in Selidove, again, situation has not really changed, but we do have information about the 2nd National Guard Brigade still operating around the Pokrovsk direction. Not an exact location has been specified, but it is important to note that this brigade is still active. And that's important because for a couple of months, we didn't really receive publicly available footage of them. Now they actually are conducting FPV strikes and the like on Russian holdings. And that means that around 2,000 men from this unit are actually involved with the defensive activities. Now, as we zoom in, the only thing of note that I could show from Selidove is this video released on the 13th of September from the 2nd Battalion of the 15th National Guard Brigade, one of the most active battalions in this part of the front line. They conducted grenade drops and FPV strikes onto the gardening houses and onto Russian soldiers advancing northwards along the rail embankment, probably with the hope of reaching the industrial facility and the waste heap, because, again, a lot of Russian sources claim it's under their control, but I've been waiting now for 2 weeks to really say definitively, and I haven't seen any proof since then. So you're looking at the 15th Brigade as the main holder, the main unit's vanguard of Selidove, but then also potentially 117th Brigade or even 2nd Galician Brigade, depending on where they're specifically placed. But there are at least 2 brigades that are involved with the actual defense in the city itself. Looking a bit northwards, as we zoom in, 25th Brigade is also defending here, so not just in Ukrainsk. They released a video that I didn't mention previously, but it's from September 7th. It's really interesting. It's a Ukrainian remote-controlled machine gun, and it was withdrawing north of Chasiv Yar. And this is not the only example. There's also another example from a bit here to the west. This is a Ukrainian remote-controlled ATGM, and it fired through this tunnel under a rail embankment towards a Russian squad operating in the northern portion of Hrodivka. That's just really interesting. It's a new way of sending in lethal force towards the front line without endangering Ukrainian troops. And so it's just something that the Ukrainians are doing where they really give them the course once they cross over the trench lines over here in yellow and make their way to the Russian line of contact or to forward Russian positions in tree lines. And that's when they begin to fire. So now we're just seeing the Ukrainians adopt more of that out of need because they can't always utilize shelling whenever they see a Russian small squad pushing through somewhere. So the Ukrainians, it's important for them. They've been able to get additional control in Krasny Yar and in Kryvyi Yar more generally. You can see here on the map that it's a gain of around 1.6 square kilometers over the past week. And this sort of acts as a buffer between the line of contact where the Russian forces, they don't really have a solid grip over the region between Zhuravka and Vuhledar. That's something that they have to work on. And then that, of course, means they can't organize an attack northwards all the way towards Mykolaiivka and the trench line. So the Ukrainians are taking advantage of that and sending in some forward elements to drag out fighting in these two villages, because then when you're contesting house to house, then it becomes more difficult to conduct rapid advances northwards. Zooming in on Hrodivka, we have an update here. Deep State, they released their September 12th update indicating Russian advances towards the city center. And also, I realized that I was too, I suppose, conservative in my mapping of Russian advances here. They are actually in control of more houses and roads than I previously imagined. So it's a capture of 0.8 square kilometers. They have presence, of course, in the entirety of this eastern protruding district, also in some of the more rural areas in the northeast. They've been able to infiltrate into the hospital, the school. There's several schools here, actually, and the Russians are in control of several of them. And this is all being done mainly along the main bisecting road, which is now pretty close when you're looking at the Russian line of contact. The Russians are pretty close to actually crossing over the Zhuravka River over here and getting a foothold in some of the more rural in nature houses in the western part of Hrodivka. And at the same time, due to this Russian push, you do have an isolation sort of being formed in the southern parts of Hrodivka that are also these private residential areas. They're not really in the core of the city, and they're sort of disconnected due to the river being in between the Ukrainian rear and the current front line, which the Russians are pretty close to severing at this specific choke points. And so Hrodivka, the fighting here is pretty gradual in nature, which is understandable. Hrodivka is one of the larger settlements that the Russians have fought over recently when you compare it to the size of the other villages the Russians have sort of hopped through in recent months. And the fighting is, of course, being dragged out due to the introduction of significant reinforcements. This has allowed the Ukrainians to actually rotate out forces. There are several examples, but the most notable is the 47th Brigade, no longer at the front line, hasn't been for a couple of weeks now, has been replaced largely by 4,000 men of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade. Besides that, you also have the 152nd Jaeger Brigade, a new unit that I only added today. This unit is a part of the 150 series brigades that were created by the Ukrainians in October of 2023. This unit completed its status of being a Jaeger unit in August of this year, and now it's just been very quickly moved into one of the fiercest parts of the front line, although the intensity has slightly died down since its climax a couple of weeks ago. Now, this will provide the Ukrainians with probably around 2,000 additional men. In terms of the quality, it's not that high of a level, just due to the fact that a lot of them are conscripts. Some of them received NATO training. They're now receiving the top tier equipment due to their classification as a Jaeger brigade. Initially, they were an infantry brigade, which would be really bad in the sense that they would only have these trucks or other sort of vehicles, very lightweight vehicles, not tracked at all. So now they've been classified with this sort of medium range Jaeger classification, which means they may contain MRAPs. I'm not sure, but they probably should have some of those more mobile, lightweight vehicles and some sort of specialization in forced fighting, swamp fighting, and the like, which isn't that useful in the setting over here. Probably would be in the Serebryansky forest, but the men themselves, just the specific quantity of 2,000 is really needed to hold the line in this area. And so they've been moved in just to create an additional buffer. Now, to look at the Chasiv Yar front a bit southwards, we're seeing the culmination of what I've described in detail in earlier videos, but for today, we'll just look at the frontline updates. Russians capturing this sort of square shape of territory, 0.6 square kilometers nearly west of Klishivka. If we're looking at the Russian extent of their advance westwards, it amounts to, let's see, nearly 1 kilometer, and the Russians are about, let's see, 2.3 kilometers away from the canal, actually 1.6 at its nearest extent. So they are very close to the canal. The largest Ukrainian node that is east of the Donbass Canal here is the forested area. And so this is an area that the Ukrainians have really in-depth knowledge of. Every single inch they have been through for years now. They have, of course, a lot of understanding of the various trees and where dugouts are located, obstacles and the like. And so overrunning it head on is going to be difficult, but that's the final obstacle before you actually reach the line itself in the canal. And there's not really water in the canal. There may be some, but it's very shallow, you could say. And then at that point, you have the opportunity to cross over. So that's one option. And then also looking south, there's also the possibility of the Russian forces utilizing the wedge they created over here over the past couple of weeks to advance from the north southwards in conjunction with an eastern advance. So you'd see a pincer movement coming in with the hopes of taking over Hrodivka, taking over some of these horizontal or vertical tree lines with trenches in them. That would be a huge objective. Finally, to clear out the remaining Ukrainian resistance that is putting up very fierce fights on the eastern side, you could say, of the bank. And of course, the eventual goal would be to cross over. And crossing over would then give the Russians, of course, the opportunity to attack Stupochki, various quarries, mines, whatever it may be, south of Chasiv Yar, and an area that is on rather similar elevation to Chasiv Yar, and would then divert some of the attention away from the direct fighting in the eastern districts of the city itself. So again, we keep on mentioning that, but it's just sort of the natural progression of what we're seeing over here, and the Ukrainians that are defending are aware of that. The Ukrainian garrison here has been severely weakened by the movement of 4,000 men away from holding on here, from the 93rd Brigade to hold on in Pokrovsk. And so the 5th Assault Brigade is really filling up the vacuum. And so their Dodo units, just this drone element, they are, of course, spotting the Russians on a daily basis, dropping grenades on them, conducting FPV strikes and the like. So yeah, that's just an update from Klishivka. Now, to echo what I was saying about our natural progression, we're seeing the same thing continue to unfold almost on a daily basis west of Pishchane. The capture of Pishchane was so important at the time. I remember it was like a month and a half ago when I was talking about it, and I said this would be the sort of key that unlocks the more broad, not necessarily collapse, but sort of cracks being formed in the Ukrainian Oskil River bridgehead, especially in the northern section of it. And so now we're seeing even more culmination of that with the Russian forces capturing 2.4 square kilometers. And really the area the Russians have been focusing on is this sort of extension of Pishchane. Not with houses, but these sort of ravines that are branching out, forested regions. These are areas where the Russian troops here thrive through, and they have tanks that provide a lot of support for them. There is a huge abundance of Russian tank regiments assisting with the infantry advances in this region. So to look at just the distances, the Russians now, they're about, let's see, 3.8 kilometers away from the road, the north-south road connecting the entire Oskil River line, and only about 5.5 kilometers away from the river itself. They're also just continuing to push southwards, and in terms of targets southwards, there isn't really much of any, but there are large fields. There's a hill over here that the Russians are sifting through, and that hill would, of course, be able to overlook whatever remaining Ukrainian holdouts are located in the chain of villages to the east, and, of course, the ones that are holding out in these larger villages and these spread out villages to the west. And so that's the implication, and it's an area that the Ukrainians are lacking in when it comes to dense reserves, and not necessarily like rear reserves when you're looking hundreds of kilometers away from the front line, but just sort of elements, battalion groupings or companies that are located a couple of kilometers away from the line of contact that could be sent in to sort of stabilize whenever there's a larger exploitation by the Russians. The Ukrainians simply don't have the wherewithal to push them back in these instances, and then you get examples like Pishchane, and then it sort of blooms out, and now you're seeing the consequences of that. It's going to continue unfolding southwards, and we're also seeing that occur northwards, as we've discussed previously. In terms of the Ukrainians that are trying to defend here, you have National Guard Unit, 1st Brigade, you have this 241st Territorial Defense Unit, one of its battalions operating over here. You have a tank unit that hasn't really been mentioned publicly that much, but they're also operating here. You have a territorial defense unit. So again, the caliber isn't that high. Probably the best unit that they have over here is the 77th Air Assault Brigade, and they're being utilized to just hold the front line in Stelmakivka as opposed to containing the advances to the west. And in terms of holding on to the village, they're doing that successfully, but they're being bogged down in an area that is being flanked, and it's not actually the main Russian objective at the moment. But now let's move on to the situation in Kursk. Now looking at Kursk, I'll begin with a minor change in the northeastern pocket fighting. Over here in my last video, I discussed the Russians actually being able to infiltrate into Cherkasskoye Porechnoye from the east, from positions that may be along the R200 highway, then branching out westwards into the village itself. That was true at the time based on the footage we had, but now additional footage has come out from the Ukrainian side, or I should say Russian side, from the 204th Akhmat Regiment, showing a compilation of significant shelling of the village, indicating that its entirety is under Ukrainian control. And so the Ukrainians, it is important that they maintain their integrity over this particular village, because it acts as a very strong perimeter and glue for the other villages nearby. It's sort of like having an infiltration in such a region would also put in danger any other village that is located along the same ravine, because then the Russians could use those same routes to expand the attacks into an area like Ruskoye, Porechnoye, or even southwards. So the fact that the Ukrainians were able to clamp down on the infiltration rather quickly, it is important, but then also, I guess you could say, it provides the Ukrainians with the opportunity to slightly advance westwards, or I should say eastwards, towards areas like Berdin and Rozgrebli, but that's not a really high priority at the moment. More so, the Ukrainians would just like to turn this village into a fortress and their sort of strong frontline perimeter to prevent any cracks being created by the Russians. So to look at the more significant developments recently, just as we zoom in, here you can see that I have marked the Russian advances now in red, the ones that occurred over the past week. I should say that the Russian advances that were launched south of Koranovo, they started 3 days ago. That was September 10th. That's when the initial Russian barrage of attacks occurred. The Russians utilized 3 platoons, and so, of course, each one had vehicles attached to it. 2 of the platoons were involved in the capture of Snagost, and now we have more footage to actually verify that capture, despite the fact that some Ukrainian sources still vehemently deny that it's fully been lost. Let's see the video itself, or the footage itself, marked on the map over here. Not this one, but there's another one that I want to show you guys. So here's footage of the VDV raising their flag in Snagost, September 13th, confirmation that it is under full Russian control. Now, there were videos from September 10th of FAB strikes on Snagost and also on some other villages like Vishnevka and a bit southwards towards Obuchovka. That's all true. That was a part of the initial Russian barrage, which included destroying the Ukrainian positions. And that was effective in a sense in then really diminishing Ukraine's offensive capacity when the attacks were conducted. And that helped in actually capturing Snagost and some of the villages along the way. So, for instance, in Krasuk-Tyaborskoye, at this point, most Ukrainian sources are admitting that it's under Russian control. There's enough proof to show that, or at the very least that it's contested. I have it marked as under full Russian control, but some Ukrainian sources still allege that there is a pocket of Ukrainian resistance that extends very deep into the front line and also includes Vishnevka, because Ukrainian sources, they allege that they were able to repel an assault by the Russians that was aimed at taking over the village in its entirety. They claim that Russian troops made it all the way to the rail station over here. It's called kilometer 344 kilometer place. It's marked over here with an X, and it's the region that the Russians allegedly arrived at. And at that point, the VDV, or Air Assault Forces from the 95th Brigade or from the 103rd Territorial Defense Unit, were involved in repelling those assaults. That's what's being alleged by some Ukrainian sources. But based on the movement of Russian troops all the way deep into Snagost and also southwards into the 10th of October, which is basically a non existent village, which now some Ukrainian sources are beginning to admit is under Russian control, it just makes it very unlikely that you have this sort of surprise pocket sticking out that is still under Ukrainian control in between. And so I'm not really buying that unless we see evidence that proves to the contrary. Now, in terms of the fluidity of the situation, we did receive reports from Ukrainian sources of fighting in Lyubimovka, and then Russian troops sources talking about fighting in Tolstoy Lug and in the farmland north of Pokrovsky, also Obuchovka. Ukrainian sources claimed that they had lost Obuchovka over the past 2 days, but that the elements of their defense were able to reorganize and conduct a counterattack that was successful over the past 24 hours, and in the process lost at least one M113. And again, the main defensive glue in this region is the 103rd TDF unit, so they're not really involved with the actual breakthroughs that the Ukrainians try to go through with, but in terms of the integrity of villages, they're really a key part of that, so they're involved in the counterattacks. So Bukhovka now, Ukrainians claim it's under their control. Some Russian sources claim that it's contested, so for now I'm not really changing the characterization. Again, areas like Venezhepnoy, Hrodivka, Uspanovka, Biekhovo, some Russian sources are adamant that it's been captured, but no proof yet to indicate that. Also in Apanasovska, this may be an area where the Ukrainians are still holding out because it does provide them with an outlet in the future to perhaps then eventually repel the Russian assaults and then push back all the way to Kursk to Aborskoy. And so it's really imperative for the Ukrainians that they have a foothold remaining in Apanasovska, just to have one final outlet in this entire region that the Russians are counterattacking in. Also, losing an area like Biekhovo, for instance, would really improve Russian logistics because they'd be able to use a vertical road, this paved route that would connect between Kuranovo and the entirety of the Seam River southern bank. So that's a part of the Ukrainian calculus as well. So in terms of the gray zone, it would probably be the region in between the Russian positions south of Kuranovo and the chain of villages that you see marked with this sort of semicircle. The big issue is the fall of such villages would begin to expose gaping holes in the Ukrainian Kursk holdings in general, because again, the Ukrainians have not had enough time to dig in, so their depth here is not that strong when it comes to static defenses. A lot of their troops are overwhelmed after over a month of fighting, intense fighting, that is, and not a lot of rotations in the process. And so it would just be a perfect storm for the Russians if they were able to break through in this crest area, because then at that point they would not receive that much resistance in between, as opposed to trying to conduct head-on assaults. Those would be repelled by the Ukrainians, whether they be from here, but really pushing in from this different flank from the rear. At that point, it's very difficult for the Ukrainians to muster the resources in time before it leads to significant hemorrhaging in control. And so that would be the sort of worst case scenario for the Ukrainians and something they're working to avoid. And part of that is by opening up a new front. And this is sort of a 2-in-1 because it could go good in the sense that it could divert Russian attention away and prevent any sort of massive breakthrough by the Russians into the Kursk holdings, but it could also help the Ukrainians finally put pressure on the Glushkovo directly. So there is sort of a dual thinking involved when the Ukrainians launch these attacks. So we know already from yesterday's video that the Ukrainians, they are present and moved forces across Novi Put. The Ukrainians, without much contest, were able to cross the anti-tank ditches and Dragon's Teeth along the border. And here you have footage from the Russian border guards of a tank, a Ukrainian tank, I should right here, and two vehicles entering into Vesaloy, with, of course, a Ukrainian squad also being filmed crossing over the Dragon's Teeth. So this entails that Obuchovka, this other Obuchovka over here, is contested along with Vesaloy. It's not under full Ukrainian control, as the border guards were still operating here in conjunction with the Air Force, trying to target whatever elements they spot. And so far, it's not a massive advance. It's a smaller scale probing operation, but we could see it expand depending on the amount of vehicles being utilized. Then we'll know how serious they are, because this is an area that is not dense in defenses whatsoever. Reports are circulating about POWs being taken over here, but nothing concrete has been released. And this region, Vesaloy, is only about, if we're measuring it, 7 kilometers away from Glushkovo, which acts as, of course, the glue between the Rilsk rear to the north and the Russian holdings south of the Siem River. So this would, of course, put a wrench into any sort of Russian planned counterattack. And also, Veseloy has a direct paved route leading into Glushkovo. So it seems like the most logical area to attack if you're going to do so. At the same time, you have reports from some Ukrainian sources of attacks towards at least Hrodivka or Sergivka, but those are not verified. Then westwards, we already know about some smaller scale infantry-based assaults into Tetkino, but nothing of that much significance. And so for now, there's not much to add about that because we haven't gotten enough information about the scale of the Ukrainian attack. Also, when it comes to the Kornovo area, we have footage of at least a dozen Ukrainian POWs being taken, which is understandable given the fact that they were caught off guard after setting up really new positions in villages that just captured, like Snagost or located west of it. So they were just caught in the large-scale movements of the Russian side. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.